December 12, 2017. Nintendo of America shares a tweet highlighting that the Nintendo Switch has officially reached 10 million consoles sold through straight to customers. December 17, 2025, we find out through an analytics firm that the Switch 2 and the Switch 1 together have sold fewer units in November in comparison to the previous year. Back when Nintendo shared this tweet in 2017, they had just finished selling 775,000 Switch 1 units in November in the United States, and sold an additional 1.5 million in December of 2017 in the United States. By the end of that month, there were a grand total of 4.876 million Switch 1 buyers. And the Circana data had indicated that despite all of its supply constraints, the original Switch was the top-selling console in the US for 6 of the first 8 months of its availability. It was also reportedly the best-selling product amongst online retailers on Thanksgiving, Black Friday, and Cyber Monday, despite not having a discount. In comparison, the Nintendo Switch 2's first November is looking to be anywhere between 440,000 and 480,000, and it is not in first place anywhere, really. As a matter of fact, going into November of 2017, per the Circana data, the original Switch had sold 2.6 million units in the United States. This was all from March until November, while it was severely supply constrained and was selling out in stores during that entire time span, because it was not available to find with ease until right around the end of October with the launch of Mario Odyssey. And given the amount of sales that it made in November and December, realistically, even though it was able to be found, it was still selling out very quickly, all throughout those final 2 months in the holiday season. Which means that the original Switch entered November with 2.6 million, and then left November with 3.376 million sold. Meanwhile, the Switch 2 enters November of 2025 with roughly 2.99 million units sold. You could probably round it up to 3 million if you wanted to, but it more or less had a 400,000 unit lead over the Nintendo Switch when they both entered Novembers in their respective launch years. And since we did not get an actual number for how many Switch 2s were sold, again, the estimates are anywhere between 440 and 480,000, depending on how optimistic you want to be, the Switch 2 walked out of November of 2025 with around 3.45, you can round up if you want to 3.5 million sold. That 400,000 lead that the Switch 2 had going into November has now shrunk down to less than 100,000. And the Switch 1 in December of 2017 sold 1.5 million units. The Switch 2 is probably not going to do that, which means that the original Switch in 2017 will have outsold the Switch 2 in 2025. Something that simply 1 week ago, nobody could have predicted. Well, except for me, because I've been saying this for months. Now, I realize many people might be thinking that the Switch 1 has been on the market for 3 months longer than the Switch 2 has because it launched in March as opposed to June, and I'm here to tell you that over the course of the next 2 or 3 months, the Switch 1 will surpass the Switch 2, with launches aligned at least in the United States. Because something like half of all console sales generally tend to occur during this holiday season, which the Switch 2 is flopping hard in. This is actually a very good lesson to many as to why they should listen to what industry analysts are saying, or rather have been saying all throughout the year, that the launch of a new console has never had this much stock available, so you can't figure out how well it's going to do long term just based off of early sales numbers. Because, just as Matt Piscatella said back in the summer, during an interview with IGN, Matt was asked if the Nintendo Switch 2 is on pace to outsell the Nintendo Switch 1. This was back in July, the end of July, around the time where the Nintendo Switch 2 floodgates were open and people were able to start buying Switch 2s no matter where they wanted, to many people's surprise. We hadn't gotten any Circana data outside of what we had seen by the end of June, and we'd soon find out that during that July, the Nintendo Switch 2 managed to sell 480,000 units. People were still very optimistic and delusional about how well the Switch 2 would do, so they would ask foolish questions like the Switch 2 topping the Switch 1 sales. But of course, people with a more level head would not think something so absurd. Matt Piscatella, the analyst from Circana, responds, and I've shared this before, lifetime sales and launch sales of a console often do not correlate, meaning that some consoles with small launches end up doing incredibly well lifetime. The PS2 only sold 400,000 in its launch month. while other big launches end up not doing as well lifetime. Since launch month demand is rarely satiated by available supply, and then this parenthesis is the very important part, and it is certainly not a great sign when it is historically. All we can really get a read on at launch is the confidence of the manufacturer to make so many units available and the ability of the supply chain to get those units into the market. To re-stress that point, it is certainly not a great sign when it is historically for a product to satiate launch demand. The reason he says this is because if the consoles are sitting in shelves so quickly after launch, it's an indication that the least price-sensitive of shoppers are done. Everybody else that's going to buy this thing is not somebody that absolutely has to own it. The Dreamcast had a record-breaking launch, and then it failed. Even the Wii U sold out initially. The PS3 completely sold out in its opening month. But pretty quickly after that, it was readily available and ultimately had to go down in price. This is why I made one of my favorite videos that I've actually made a few months ago, highlighting that the Switch 2 officially has the worst US launch demand in 10 years. Because logically, I don't look at launch demand as what was available on the first month or the first weekend of a console's launch. That's not launch demand, that's launch supply. That's automatically going to sell out. Launch demand is the point at which a console is officially sitting on shelves or able to be picked up easily and no longer requires you to battle bots and scalpers, no longer requires you to camp out overnight. Once a game console reaches that point in time, that's when their sales start to stabilize. When I made this video back 2 months ago, I used the Google search function where you can search specific months in any given year to find out at what point in time articles or people in forums stopped saying that they could not find the console anywhere. Everybody wants it no matter what, thus demand goes up, scalpers and bots buy it out, they increase the price increases with demand, it all levels off, and then eventually the consoles are just sitting on shelves waiting for people to buy them. Once I figured out which month the console was deemed to have satiated demand, I cross-referenced that month with the Circana data for that specific console and reached a conclusion of how many units were sold by the time the game console reached that point in time. I even made a table out of it, and that's what you see over here. And to no surprise, the Nintendo Switch 2 sits lower than any console that was launched after 2014. And it's because the gaming industry has grown over time, and people's obsession with spending, with that FOMO, with being part of the early adoption conversation, has grown along with it. Now, in fairness, the Switch 2 is not that far behind the Switch 1 and the PS4 by this metric. And above those, the Wii was kind of an exception because that thing just kind of kept selling as soon as it hit the shelves for a little over a year. But post-COVID, the Switch 2 completely didn't live up to the hype of the Xbox Series console as well as the PlayStation 5. And the crazy thing is, even if you were to remove the chip shortages and you were to remove all of the additional spending that people had because they thought they were going to lose their lives because of a pandemic, even if you were to cut those PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series numbers in half, they would still be outpacing the Switch 2 by quite a margin. The reason I had made this video and made this chart is because I wanted people to understand the difference between launch supply and launch demand. And I also wanted to make that video so that I knew when December comes around and the Switch 2 is not selling nearly as well as the Switch 1, because of how quickly launch demand was satiated, I wanted to refer back to the table like I am right now to make it clear that these November results that we've seen for the Nintendo Switch 2 are not surprising at all. In fact, this was a concern that should have been seen months ago. And maybe it was seen by Matt Piscatella, for example, because he did warn people that launch month demand is rarely satiated by available supply, and it's certainly not a great sign when it is historically. What's funny is around that same time, I remember many people asking him if it means that the Switch 2 was actually at the correct price and people were overblowing it for no reason. And he kept reiterating that people that buy consoles at launch are the least price sensitive. And he also reiterated over and over again that he expects that the Switch 2, having such a high availability of stock, very likely pulled forward holiday numbers. Which, of course, these are all things that I've already discussed quite a bit on my channel over the past few months. Now, I realize if you haven't been following my channel, you might be confused as to how any of this makes any sense. I opened up this video talking about how the Switch had 10 million consoles sold through in December of 2017. And rightfully, you might be scratching your head right now thinking to yourself, wait a second, the Switch 2 had already sold over 10 million back in September, because when we got Nintendo's quarterly reports, it shows that they had that many sold by the time they got to September 30th. But the unfortunate reality that many people don't realize is that those 10.36 million were sold in numbers, not sold through numbers, which are numbers that are shipped and not sold. I made a video explaining that, and you can go back to that video if you don't believe me. And then in the very next video, I even analyzed that 10.36 million that was sent out. It's a much longer video, so if you'd like to get educated as to why the Switch 2 failed this holiday season, you can watch that video as well. The sad reality is for Nintendo is that right now they cannot share a tweet about how many consoles were shipped. Or at least they haven't until now. Knowing my luck, they'll probably send something out tomorrow. And the reason they can't do that is because they either just hit 10 million sold, maybe 11 million sold through to customers, or what's worse is they might actually still be sitting beneath 10 million sold. And it's not that absurd of an estimate. Most analysts and experts believe that Japan and USA each take up roughly 1/3 of Nintendo's user base. The US is sitting around 3.5 million, Japan is sitting just over 3 million, and all signs have been indicating for months that Europe and the rest of the world are performing worse than those two. It's actually entirely possible that there are not 10 million sold through Switch 2 units to the customer yet. Unless you think countries like Greenland and Zimbabwe are making up the numbers. But again, you can watch that super long video that I uploaded if you want a further breakdown on that. But the point is that Nintendo needs to do something right now. They need to share a tweet. They need to make a big announcement. They need to do something to save their shareholder value, which is in free fall. Because this is around the time where they would normally do something to stop that number from decreasing as much as it is. And again, I have a video describing the Nintendo stock value and how they manipulate it with various announcements. The last time Nintendo's stock value was in this bad of a freefall, conveniently it was leaked to Bloomberg that they would increase production of the Switch 2 units. And that resulted in the numbers going back up the other way, which kept it on a bit of a rally until the Nintendo quarterlies, where people wrongfully assumed that there were 10 million sold through Switch 2s to customers at that point in time, and that just led to the number going back up again, until, of course, it leveled off and started to drop downwards again, and continued to drop even further downwards when people found out that the PlayStation 5 was outselling the Switch 2 over the holidays. And to add insult to injury for Nintendo, while it was already in free fall, the RAM prices situation came up and it just kept dropping further and further down below. And then now with Circana sharing data that the Switch 1 last year outsold the Switch 1 and Switch 2 this year, it's just not looking good for Nintendo. This would be the perfect time for them to be like, hey, just so everybody knows, we have sold through 10 million units in December. And everybody could celebrate because it's matched the Switch 1 numbers, which means it's probably going to continue to grow. But they can't do that because the numbers were expected to be much higher for the Switch 2 because they built up that much hype early on with the launch, manufacturing artificial hype, and unfortunately getting people to expect that the Switch 2 was going to be much larger than it actually was. And again, you can go back to my video I made around the launch of the Switch 2 if you want to hear more about that. I covered all of these talking points, and they all led to the moment that we're seeing right now. This terrible, terrible, abysmal holiday season for a brand new console where you expect that it will outperform everything around it. But the PlayStation 5 didn't have this issue. They outsold the Switch 2 at the same price as the Switch 2. The PlayStation 5 last year in November launched the PlayStation 5 Pro. This new launch of the PlayStation 5 Pro gave November of 2024 a big bump. I think the PlayStation 5 Pro made up roughly 25 to 30% of its total sales. So while we do see a 40% drop off in PS5 sold this year, it looks a lot worse than it actually is because you're going from a launch of a new model to just the regular base model being sold, and there are no aggressive discounts. I discussed this in my previous video, but the PlayStation 4 in 2017 also outsold the original Switch, but back then, that PlayStation 4 was being sold for $200. This past November from Sony was bad. There is no tiptoeing around that. And it's deservedly bad because by this point in time, they should be giving a much more aggressive discount for the PlayStation 5 than simply selling it to people at what they would have paid for it at launch. Xbox is completely out of the picture as well. And with what is effectively one of the largest pillars of the gaming industry of the past 20 years, completely bowing out, you would expect a massive drop-off like we've seen in November, to an extent. But you should also consider that Xbox did not discount their console. They had no intention of making high numbers of sales in November. They probably knew that even if they discounted it, it wouldn't do that well. But Xbox already has a fairly large user base here in the United States, and they have their games available elsewhere. People are playing them on PC, some of the Xbox games are coming to PlayStation, Game Pass is available to stream on any device. Xbox fans still are out there and they're still buying games, believe it or not, or at least subscribing to Game Pass. But as far as the hardware console sale conversation goes, Xbox has completely bowed out, or rather they've just about completely bowed out. And similarly, you kind of expect that Nintendo does not care if they sell Switch 1s anymore, because they increased the price of that console. They want people to focus more on the Switch 2. So what you have here is a PlayStation 5 whose discount is basically the launch price that it had, and it already has a massive user base here in the United States. An Xbox console, which is just not even trying to compete and sell hardware anymore, and a Switch 1 that Nintendo increased the price of in hopes that people will look at it and be like, oh, I'd rather get a Switch 2 if it's only that much more expensive. And of course, you have the NEX Playground, which is currently sold out and is being scalped on eBay for roughly the price of a Switch 2, ironically enough, showing that there are indeed people out there willing to spend money this Black Friday. But basically, what I am trying to get at is that this Black Friday is the easiest Black Friday for somebody to take home a trophy and say they won the month of November. As a matter of fact, there has probably never been a better chance to take advantage of your competition bowing out than it is currently in 2025. There has never been a more opportune moment for a console, a brand new console, one that was supposedly the most hyped thing over the past 2 or 3 years, one that has supposedly been what everybody wants and is priced at the correct number and was given the perfect killer app in Mario Kart World, and Pokemon Legends ZA was like the perfect companion to go into the holidays. And then you got the cult classics like Metroid Prime 4 and Kirby Air Riders and Hyrule Warriors. And you can play your GameCube games if you subscribe to Nintendo Switch Online, and you can grab all of those same games you've been playing for 8 years and get a slight little resolution and frame bump on them. The perfect opportunity for something like that to come into the United States, a country known where game consoles are supposedly recession-proof, and people are willing to put themselves in debt, willing to make payments with interest on stuff just to make sure everybody's happy during the holidays. The country where people go nuts to spend and spend and spend, and consumerism is probably at its absolute worst than anywhere else in the world. The easiest chance for something like the Nintendo Switch 2 to come in and absolutely demolish the competition, and despite that, it barely surpassed half of what the PlayStation 5 did in November. Make no mistake about what I'm about to say, and I want this to resonate in your mind for a few months from now, where I can point back to this video again, just like I'm doing with the other ones that I had just referenced for you. While the console gaming industry is absolutely struggling, and there's no doubt about that, it's been struggling for over a year now, it is struggling much worse because of how poorly the Nintendo Switch 2 is doing. The Nintendo Switch 2 should be papering over the cracks of this downward spiral that we're in, supposedly. And there are more than enough people that would have been willing to buy into the Nintendo Switch 2 if the value proposition was there. And what we would have seen was a November where the Nintendo Switch 2 blew everybody else out of the water, because they're all walking in with black eyes already. They can barely see. Just 1 or 2 quick sucker punches from Nintendo, and November would have been theirs. The only one of these companies that actually failed in November, and is likely to end up failing once we get the numbers for December as well, is Nintendo. It's losing to a 5-year-old console that has already seen satiated demand, has not released that many games, is not even on a good discount in comparison to its launch price, and that console is outpacing its predecessor, which was one of the best-selling consoles of all time. The Switch 2 is losing to that because of how poor of a value proposition the Switch 2 is. I'm gonna say something a little bit more extreme than I normally do. I've never said that the Switch 2 would be as bad as the Wii U, sales number wise at least. I think that the Switch 2 is guaranteed to outsell the Wii U, and I've said that from day one. As a matter of fact, when you're considering all of the shipped units, it probably already surpassed the Wii U. If not, then it will in the next month or so. But I think unless there's something dramatic that changes very soon for Nintendo, there's a very good chance that calling this the Wii U 2 is not out of the question. That doesn't mean that it'll sell as bad as the Wii U. It just means that we might be in a similar situation at the end of all this, unless something changes. There's a very simple way for Nintendo to solve all of this. Their stock value that has been flying high through all of this Switch 2 hype starting from over a year ago. That stock value that peaked in August and then started to go downwards. And I've been following along and telling you guys this thing's gonna end up pretty low. We're almost at the point now where we're going to be lower than it was in April before it started to skyrocket after the Switch 2 Direct, along with the hype of the Switch 2. And then it peaked with the hype of the Switch 2, and it's been on a downward spiral ever since. We're almost at that point where it's going to be back to January numbers, where all of the confidence that investors had through all of 2025 goes out the window. And all I can think back to was similar talking points that I had throughout the year. I'm reminded of the launch of the 3DS, which had a great first holiday season, despite the massive backlash that it had for being overpriced in 2011. And this is because in July of 2011, Reggie Fils-Aimé addressed the public and said for anybody who was on the fence about buying a Nintendo 3DS, this is a huge motivation to buy now. We are giving shoppers every incentive to pick up a Nintendo 3DS from an amazing new price to a rapid-fire succession of great games. They dropped the console from $250 to $169.99. It was a 30% price cut. And then they announced an amazing lineup of games to close off the year. The 3DS went from selling fewer units on a monthly basis than we see the Switch 2 doing, to having a much better November than the Switch 2. Imagine if Nintendo 2 or 3 months ago had announced a 30% price cut from the $450 Switch 2. Heck, even a 20% discount would have taken it from $450 to $350. They probably could have even gotten away with a 12.5% discount and taken it from $450 to $400. Imagine if Nintendo had done that while this was very obvious that this November was coming up, and there is zero chance that it would not have outsold the PlayStation 5. But of course, they did not, and now they're facing the consequences. And look, just a very quick thing to close off with, because this is a talking point that I've seen quite a bit. The assumption many people are having here is that the Switch 2 is facing a console war, and it's being only purchased by the enthusiasts that love Nintendo. I want to make it very clear that the people that are hating on the Nintendo Switch 2 are not console warring. They're not the PlayStation 5 fans, nor are they the Xbox fans. Not at least en masse. They might be laughing at it now because of November, but through most of the Switch 2's announcement and then life cycle, PlayStation fans, Xbox fans, PC fans, they viewed it as what it should be, a stronger and more powerful Switch 1. This is very normal for them. And the way they view Nintendo is those Nintendo fans are gonna buy it anyway. They buy everything that Nintendo puts out. And for most of those PlayStation fans, Xbox fans, even the PC guys, they all had original Switch 1s as their secondary console. They're not the ones that were console warring against the Switch 2. And many of them are the ones who bought the Switch 2 because they wanted to play Zelda in 4K. The console warring that's occurred for the Nintendo Switch 2 is not from the competitors. It's from within. It's a civil war. The people that bought the Switch 2 are of twofold. Part of them are the hardcore tech enthusiasts, the people that love gaming, the people that love the idea of having a handheld device to play your Nintendo games. It's going to be their secondary device, and they bought it, and it's been sitting on shelves for a while because they thought they were going to get better performances for the third-party titles. There are many of those buyers, and most of those buyers are the ones that have either sold it or decided they have buyer's remorse for a plethora of reasons. Again, you can watch that video too. And in addition to those people, there are individuals out there that were just kind of like, oh, I guess the Switch 2's in stock. I guess I'll pick it up because I might never be able to find a console that's in stock like this. And again, those same individuals are probably secondary Nintendo fans in that they have something that is their primary game machine, and then they buy the Nintendo device on the side. I would say those non-Nintendo enthusiasts, and they're more like gaming/tech enthusiasts, make up at least like 30% of the Switch 2 user base. The rest of the Switch 2 buyers are probably half, maybe even less than half of the Nintendo fandom. Because the people that are the most vocal against the Nintendo Switch 2 right now, the ones that are console warring, those are Nintendo fans. There is nobody that would be as obsessive against the Switch 2 than somebody that absolutely is a hardcore Nintendo fan. This idea that the enthusiasts are the only ones that bought the Switch 2 and the casuals are not buying it is partially true. The enthusiasts are the ones that are buying the Switch 2. But the enthusiast pool of Nintendo fans that would have bought the Switch 2 would make that thing sell out immediately. That supposed vocal minority that you're seeing the entirety of the internet go on a tirade against the Nintendo Switch 2, those are Nintendo fans. All of us had year one 3DSs. All of us had Wii U's. And all of us bought the Nintendo Switch 1 in its first few months. But we sat out for the launch of the Switch 2. Make no mistake, if every single Nintendo enthusiast actually decided to buy into this console because Nintendo was not being greedy as hell, they would not be sitting on shelves a week before Christmas time. And the outlook of the console gaming industry, while it would still be looking like it's going downwards, would not be nearly as negative as it is right now.